Hey everybody, this is Dr. Everson. Today we're talking about the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible, found within the Pentateuch. It's a very famous book. What you see before you here is a clay tablet with writing on it, writing that is in cuneiform. Cuneiform is the oldest writing system on earth. It predates the alphabet by, well, at least 1,000 years. So in southern Mesopotamia, they developed this way of writing where they would take a piece of clay and press it into about this square in front of you is about the size of a deck of cards, and that was a common size for a tablet, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. And the beauty of a clay tablet is that it's simple and cheap to produce, right? You simply dig and you find suitable clay. And you might be able to sort of fashion suitable clay by mixing different types of earth. And your writing system is simply a stylus that's a certain size and has a certain shape on the end of it. And you make impressions into the clay. It's simple and it's cheap and it's also long lasting. One of the benefits of cuneiform is that you may sometimes have an original text, right? With manuscripts, and that's what the Bible is written on, manuscripts, which are made from parchment or papyrus. They're made from animal skin or from paper made out of reeds. The manuscripts deteriorate and disappear, whereas a cuneiform tablet lasts and lasts for thousands of years. And it could be in a house that burns down. That's not a problem because then you just bake the tablet and it might last even longer. So anyway, I thought it might be useful just to put a image of cuneiform on here. We'll be looking at some sources later as we talk about the history, the historical Exodus, the question of the Exodus and history, and some of the sources that are used to corroborate or challenge the biblical account are from cuneiform sources. So anyway, people back in the days of the Israelites were writing things, and we can look at those texts to gain better understanding of the Old Testament. Okay, so the literary structure of the book of Exodus. The book of Genesis, as you will recall from last week, the structure of it is pretty simple. Though there is the so-called Toledot formula, most folks, when they diagram or describe the literary structure of the book of Exodus, they do it according to its plot. And so they'll look at the beginnings, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and sort of put all of those stories together in one group, and then they will look at the patriarchs after that, maybe looking at the Abraham stories, and then the Jacob stories, and then the Joseph stories, or you could sort of consider all of them as a large section describing the patriarchs. The structure for the book of Exodus is very similar in that it's simple, right? There's just sort of three main sections. Here we have an artist's description of the tabernacle. You see the presence of God being indicated by the flaming pillar. We see the altar that's out in front of it. Anyway, the first 15 chapters, we have the Exodus from Egypt. Let me say a word about the etymology of the word Exodus. Etymology, of course, refers to the origin of words or the root of words, literally. Hodos in Greek means road. Ex means from, so ex hodos means the road out. Hodos as in odometer in your car. For some of you who do Greek and get into all that, this is probably familiar to you. And so the word Exodus simply means the road out of Egypt. Two of the most significant events for the Israelite people occur in the book of Exodus. And of course, the first one is the Exodus from Egypt, and this occurs in the first part of the book of Exodus. So in this single event of the Exodus, the Israelites as a people are sort of transformed from an enslaved people to a liberated nation. They didn't have a homeland, and they're enslaved, and now suddenly they are no longer enslaved, and they are on their way to acquiring a homeland. So, and I would say here it's important to note that, as is often the case with Scripture, God is the hero of this episode, right? So the text just sort of beats you over the head with the fact that this is not something that the Israelites did for themselves. God is the principal actor in the story. God is the hero. Okay, the story begins in chapter 1 of Exodus with the statement that a Pharaoh arose in Egypt that did not know Joseph, right? And their plight changes. Now suddenly, instead of being friends of Pharaoh and living in security and safety, the Israelites are now at odds with Pharaoh, and they are made to work for Pharaoh through force, right? They're enslaved by him. The Israelites grow in number. Their population, they are fruitful and they multiply, and their population grows quite large, to the extent that the Pharaoh of Egypt is concerned of their population becoming too great. This is a concern throughout the world, throughout history. One people group being threatened by the presence of another people group. So his plan is to have the firstborn of the male offspring, the male infants of the Israelites. I shouldn't giggle because it's very sad. I'm tongue-tied sometimes. To be killed, right? The plan is to kill off boy babies, and Moses is one of those. And so to save him, he's placed in a basket. The Hebrew word is tevah, which is the word ark in the Noah story. He's placed in a basket and he's saved. He is raised in Pharaoh's household, and that Pharaoh's daughter takes pity on this infant, and that's the birth of Moses, saved from destruction. So he goes from this precarious situation to this very safe situation. And we see this often in the Bible, of things being turned upside down. Jesus talks this way in the New Testament, of course, too, that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and to find your life you must lose it, this sort of a thing. Moses grows up in a privileged position. His mother is nearby. His birth mother, his biological mother, is nearby, and he learns of his heritage as he grows up. And one day he sees an Egyptian striking, beating an Israelite, and he intervenes and ends up killing the Egyptian and seeks to hide the evidence of his crime. And the next day, another Israelite comments on his behavior the previous day, namely the murder, and Moses becomes frightened and he flees. And he goes to the land of Midian, the desert of Midian. There he meets Zipporah, and it's also there that he has this, living a nomadic life in Midian, he has this experience of the burning bush. So he sees a bush that's consumed by fire, a bush that's engulfed in flames but is not consumed by the fire. Right? Normally bush, if something's on fire, it's consumed and it turns to ash, and this doesn't happen with the bush. And so when he's there, the Lord speaks to him from within the fire. And it's interesting to me that fire is often used to describe the presence of God, right? We saw this in the covenant that God has with Abraham. We see it here. We'll see it later with the pillar of fire that's used to guide the Israelites out of Egypt. So he sees God from the burning bush, and it's during this time that he is called to lead his people. And with the help of Aaron, he does so, there are the 10 plagues that are leveled against Pharaoh and the Egyptians, which lead to the Israelites leaving Egypt. They're then pursued by Pharaoh. The Red Sea is parted. Pharaoh's army is drowned, and the people make it safely to the wilderness. So that all happens in 15 chapters. So those first 15 chapters of Exodus are pretty action-packed, as it were. So they're out. And then what? Well, the next few chapters, chapters 15 through 18, describe the Israelites traveling through the wilderness to Mount Sinai. And so this functions as a transition between the Exodus from Egypt and the giving of the law at Sinai. And it's during these chapters that on a number of occasions the people complain about hunger and thirst, thus demonstrating a lack of faith in God, right? And so the Israelites have this notorious reputation for being untrusting or unfaithful, ungrateful, grumbling folks, right? And of course, this is most people, like I'm the old joke, who I can't stand? Who? People. Yeah, they're the worst, right? So we can be this way. However, despite their seeming ungratefulness, God still saves them. And then next we move to the Israelites at Sinai, and there's a couple of important episodes that happen here. And I should have included here the giving of the law. I just put the golden calf in the tent of meeting, but the giving of the law, this is perhaps the most significant act of God within the Old Testament. And within Judaism, it certainly is, right? So in Judaism, at the sort of the center of gravity of Judaism would be the law, right? So the foundational document for rabbinic Judaism really isn't the Bible, it's the Talmud. And at the center of the Talmud is the Mishnah, and the Mishnah itself is a law code. And so there's a tradition within Judaism that the Mishnah is sort of really what Moses received at Mount Sinai, right? This memorized law, this Torah Shebe'al Peh. So anyway, the giving of the law at Sinai, it's hard to overestimate its importance. And if you look at the first 10 commandments in Exodus chapter 20, you'll see that they begin by mentioning the Exodus, right? And this becomes a motivation for behavior. Since God has delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh, he has essentially earned the right to establish these laws for the Israelites. Incidentally, I've recorded myself singing a song for you that might help you memorize the 10 Commandments. It's called The Perfect 10. So that's on the YouTube channel too. If you're, if you want to be amused, you can watch, my silly face singing this song, or you could learn the song yourself and then have them memorized. Israel is invited to become the people of God, right? To become a holy nation and a priestly nation. This may be what Exodus 22:18 is referring to when it states that all nations of the earth will be blessed. Genesis 22:18. All nations on earth will be blessed on account of Abraham. Right? This giving of the law is part of Israel becoming a priestly nation. In Exodus 24:7-8, we have the Israelites entering into a covenant with God. So let me just turn and read that for you quickly here. So Exodus 24, verses 7 and 8 reads, "Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, 'We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey.' Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." Right. So the law is connected to the covenant. Right. There are expectations that God has for the people, and these are found in the law. So law and covenant go hand in hand. So that's very, very important. Moving on through this section after Exodus 24, looking on to 25 through 31, if the Israelites are to be God's people and he is going to reside among them, then he will need some sort of dwelling. And of course, the Israelites, when you read the Old Testament, they talk both ways. They talk of God as being God spanning the heavens with his hand, and God being the heavens are his throne and the earth is his footstool. Like God cannot be contained when you read the Old Testament. At the same time, they will also talk about God having a home. And of course, in the book of Exodus, this is the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. Although people debate, are these two separate structures or are they one? And I won't get into that today. But needless to say, in the tabernacle, God has a special presence. He's especially present, or he's present in a special way in the tabernacle as he is in the temple. Though the writer of the Pentateuch and those who wrote like the heavens are his throne and the earth is his footstool. I believe that's in Isaiah, although it could be wrong. I'm drawing a blank. Those writers also, though they knew God had a special presence in these structures, they also knew that he couldn't be contained. So anyway, the Bible speaks of both ways. Long story short, there is a description for building a sort of portable temple in the book of Exodus, and this is the tent of meeting or the tabernacle. And you've read through them, hopefully, chapters 25 through 31. They describe the building and the function of the tabernacle. And it's tough to read, right? Because you've got lengths of curtains and staves and rings and embroidery, and it's not a story of David slaying Goliath. It's sort of tedious to read in a way. But at the same time, reading a description of God creating, the Israelites creating a tabernacle for God, the ornate detail, the elaborate number of steps, all the great care and effort that went into it, is indicative of the value that they place in that, right? This was very, very important to the Israelites. God is to be revered. God is to be honored. God is to not be taken lightly. If God is going to dwell among the people, if it is going to be Emmanuel, God with us, then we, as his creatures, should do everything we can to honor God with a special home among us. So, though it's difficult to read, you can see the importance of it. Moving beyond that, in the next few chapters 32 through 34, we see the great goof up for the Israelites. Within the Christian history of interpretation, the fall described in the Garden of Eden is perhaps the greatest blunder ever, or it is, right? I don't think that's really up for debate. Within Judaism, however, the great blunder is really the golden calf. This should have been the greatest moment of honor for the Israelites, and they go from this great moment of honor to this great moment of shame, right, where God had sort of given them the greatest gift of this law, and in the midst of the giving, they abandoned God. Moses goes up onto the mountain to receive the law, and as he's there, the people begin to worry that he's not going to come back, and they pressure Aaron into taking their gold and creating a calf that they can worship. And he does. And God is unhappy with them. He contemplates destroying them as a result and starting over with Moses. And Moses asks God to not do that. And God changes his mind, or he decides not to. Nacham is the verb that's used there, and it's often debated what that verb means, but God experiences remorse or regret, and he decides not to destroy the people. Okay, and then after the golden calf, you have in chapters 35 through 40 additional laws that are given, and the description of the creation of the tabernacle is also given. And so that's just sort of a bird's eye view of the literary structure of Egypt. In the first 15 chapters, they leave Egypt. Then they travel from Egypt to Sinai, where there is grumbling. And then they make it to Sinai, where they set up their camp. Moses goes up onto the mountain to receive the law. The people make this great blunder and worship the golden calf. And God decides to be gracious and merciful, and then we have additional laws that are given. So that's the book of Exodus in a nutshell. This image here that you see before you is the Ten Commandments as it appears in the book of Exodus, and also as it appears in the book of Deuteronomy. So on the right you have the book of Exodus, and you can see, well, there it says verse 4. Wait. I don't think those are verse numbers on the right. I think those are, anyway, in Hebrew on the right, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. So remember the Sabbath day. And of course, that's how it appears in Exodus. Whereas on the left, you see Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, which is keep or observe the day of the Sabbath. And so they're slightly different. Okay, anyway, why do I have this image up here? What's going on? You have the Ten Commandments being given twice in the Pentateuch. The first time in Exodus chapter 20, and the second time in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 6 to 21. And let me go through a few of the differences first, and then we'll ask some questions about these differences. So the fourth commandment, which I was just reading in Hebrew, they are slightly different. One says remember, one says observe. It's the Sabbath commandment. The fifth commandment is slightly different in the book of Exodus versus the book of Deuteronomy. We have the phrase as the Lord, and let me just look at the text here. So let me just read the fifth commandment, number 5. We also strive to honor father and mother. That's the commandment. So verse 12 in Exodus reads, honor your father and mother that you may long endure. In Deuteronomy, there's a portion that's added, honor your father and mother, and then this additional part appears, as the Lord your God commanded you, that you may long endure. And then there's another addition in Exodus, that you may fare well. Okay, so it's slightly different. There's a couple of minor additions to the fifth commandment in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay, moving on, the ninth commandment. I say false and false, and that's only because there's one Hebrew word used for false in Exodus, and there's a different Hebrew word used for false in Deuteronomy, which you can see on that previous slide if you're really keen to find out. And then in the 10th commandment, you have the reversal of house and wife when it comes to coveting. So in Exodus it reads, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife." Whereas in Deuteronomy it says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and you shall not crave your neighbor's house." Okay, and then or his field, that's also added. Okay, and some of you might be thinking, well, who cares, right? They're slightly different. Or some of you might be thinking, oh my goodness, they're different. Shouldn't they be exactly the same? How could this be? And here's just some thoughts and questions for you. The Ten Commandments appear twice in the Old Testament. The word Deuteronomy, as I'll repeat when we get to the book of Deuteronomy, literally means second law. Deutero meaning second, and nomos meaning law, as in our English word nomenclature. So Deuteronomy literally means the second law. So the Ten Commandments appear twice in the Old Testament. And one question I could ask is, well, why are there multiple covenants? Right? God made a covenant with Noah. God made a covenant with Abraham. God makes a covenant with Moses. Then Moses and the Israelites, and then that covenant is later renewed after the time of Moses. And so why does this happen? Why are there multiple covenants? Or you could ask the question, why is the story of Jesus told 4 times in the New Testament? Right? You finish Matthew, and then you turn the page, and you're back over at the start of Jesus' ministry. How is this? And then in Luke, they go back to the birth of Jesus. Why is this? Or another one that we could add to this list would be the books of Samuel and Kings, especially the stories of David and following, are reproduced in the books of Chronicles, right? So Chronicles copies from Samuel and Kings, chapters and chapters, often word for word. Why is this? And so I think it gets at a very fundamental theological principle. And I would say that God speaks to people in different times and places in specific ways that might be tailored to their situation. And I'm sure this is a phrase I've not come up with, and I've heard it somewhere, I'm not sure where, but the idea of contextual or contextualized revelation. That God reveals himself to people in language and in ways that is most useful to them, or is very useful to them. So using the Hebrew language, using the sacrificial system, using covenant formulas, right? So the covenant formulas that you see in the Old Testament, these formulas show up elsewhere. Well, we mentioned the one with Abraham, but the covenant formulas you see later on after Abraham, these find parallels elsewhere too. And I think it's the idea that the Bible gives us a story of God reaching out to humanity. And this is a sort of apologetics claim that people will make, that throughout the world you see many instances of humans trying to find God, and in the Bible we see many instances of God reaching out to humanity. And I would say that's true to a certain extent. We do see that cliche, or that proposition is made with good reason. Okay, so there's 2 Ten Commandments, and as I would see it, in the book of, during the days of Moses, right after the Exodus from Egypt, when he's at Sinai, that was a different time than the situation in the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses is sort of making his farewell to the Israelites years later. So anyway, different time, different place, and it's adjusted. Okay, moving on. Authorship of the Pentateuch. This is a topic that we didn't get to last week, which we certainly could have, and it's very customary to do so. But, there's 5 books in the Pentateuch, and we can tackle this issue really at any time. And we'll just jump right in here. Sort of at the heart of this whole debate, what it stems from, it's described in the ancient world and in the modern world. Why does the biblical text sometimes use Lord or Yahweh for verses or chapters at a time, and then it will switch to God or Elohim for verses or chapters at a time? Why isn't it consistent? This is a topic that was discussed in the ancient world as well in the modern world. So let me grab my notes here. So Philo, I believe this is a Rembrandt portrait of Philo. Of course, Rembrandt and Philo were not contemporaries. Philo, who lived in the century prior to Jesus, lived in a much more ancient time than Rembrandt. But anyway, there's Philo. Philo is from a city called Alexandria, which is in Egypt. Of course, Alexandria was a very, very Greek place. And so people who lived in Alexandria in the century prior to Christ, like Philo, they spoke Greek, they wrote in Greek. Philo himself was a brilliant Jewish scholar, and he's considered the father of allegory. Allegory is a method of interpreting texts. It's usually people talk about interpreting the Bible with it, but this was also something that was done to interpret the epic poems of Homer, right? So some folks in the ancient world were embarrassed by the behavior of Zeus, in the Iliad or the Odyssey. And so they would say, well, Zeus really isn't a personal god who behaves like an idiot. Zeus is actually the representation of the sky or the heavens. And so whenever it talks about Zeus, it's really a way of describing the movements of the heavens. And so this is really a symbolic sort of a thing. And so there's a deep or hidden meaning to the text. And Paul in the book of Galatians does an allegory on Sarah and Hagar. And then later on within Christianity, allegory becomes a very popular method of interpreting Scripture. And Origen from Alexandria at the end of the 2nd century becomes a very famous proponent of allegory. So anyway, prior to Jesus, Philo in Alexandria, he notices differences in language in the Old Testament. He noticed that sometimes God is referred to as Theos in Greek, which of course comes from the Hebrew term Elohim. And he also noticed that sometimes God is referred to as Kurios in Greek, which means Lord, which comes from the Hebrew Yahweh. And in one of his texts called Allegorical Interpretation, section 1, paragraph 95, he writes, very naturally, therefore, does God at present address commands and recommendations to the earthly mind, which is neither bad nor good, but of an intermediate character. And recommendation is employed in the 2 names, in that of the Lord and of God. For the Lord God commanded that if man obeyed his recommendations, he should be thought worthy of receiving benefits from God, Theos. But if he rejected his warnings, he should then be cast out by destruction by the Lord, Kurios, as his master and one who had authority over him. So whenever Theos is used, this points to God's mercy, and whenever Kurios is used, which is the Greek term for Lord or Master, it points to sort of the harsh side of God, the punishing side of God. Okay, so this is Philo in the 1st century before Christ. Before we move on to the modern period, in the 17th century, the very famous Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza from the Netherlands, way back then in the 17th century, in the 1600s, he came to the conclusion that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. Rather, it probably came from Ezra the scribe. And this means he's placing the formation of the Pentateuch into the Persian period. So that's Spinoza in the 17th century. Okay, so you may have heard of the documentary hypothesis. People often will just say JEDP. Um, the guy who sort of coined that idea or sort of really put that on the map was a guy named Julius Wellhausen, and that's his image there on the screen. But hopefully, as you can see from just the thumbnail sketch that I will give you here, and let me give you the clear impression that there is a massive amount of literature on this. I mean, books upon books have been written about just the scholarship. And of course, that means you have many summaries of the scholarship, and the scholarship itself, the primary scholarship, is a mountain of information, most of which is in German. And that would be academic German from the 1800s. So it's a tough road to hoe if this is the kind of thing you're into. And lots of people have sort of gone down this road. And so I will just give you a very brief thumbnail sketch. So as we will see, the documentary hypothesis, it's something that developed over a long period of time. Essentially, every scholar built upon or adapted what the previous scholars had done. And this is like anything, right? The Wright brothers were the first in flight, but of course, they were working on the shoulders of those who had gone before them. Same with Thomas Edison. I mean, every great thinker adapts what is handed to them. So over the process of 100+ years, this hypothesis evolved, and it's always changing, right? So I mean, Wellhausen, yes, gives us this classic idea of JEDP, but today people are constantly dismantling and reorganizing and changing this within mainline source criticism, as they call it. Okay, so way back in the 18th century, so 100 years or so after Spinoza, there was a French medical professor by the name of Jean Astruc. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. He published a work on Genesis, which really sort of marks the beginning of source criticism for the Pentateuch. Now, this guy, Jean Astruc, he thought that Moses really relied on sources that came from the period of the patriarchs. And so when Moses would use Elohim, or when Moses would use Yahweh, he thought he had some ancient source from Abraham's time or something. And he's simply editing these things together. And so we're starting down the road towards Wellhausen and JEDP, but these are believed to be from the time of Moses. And so today this would not be a controversial perspective, the idea that Moses would use sources. And many scholars today still feel that way, that Moses did use sources when he put the Pentateuch together. So this is distinct from Spinoza and later scholars, right? This is still Moses. That's the point I'm making. So Moses had sources that he used. And Jean Astruc refers to these as documents. Okay, so that's 1753, and that was persuasive for lots of folks. Okay, there's another scholar from a later time period, from 1807, not too long later, De Wette. He equates the legal core at the center of Deuteronomy with the book of the law that was found during the renovations done by Josiah, which is described in 2 Kings chapter 22. And this becomes a very popular thesis for the book of Deuteronomy and stuff that follows Deuteronomy, which some people call the Deuteronomic or the Deuteronomistic history. So this Deuteronomy was something that was created during the days of Josiah. And this idea comes from De Wette, however you want to say his name. And so this becomes the most important criterion for dating D to a late time period, right? So when did Josiah live? Well, he lived in the 7th century. He lived in the 600s. Many scholars today still believe in this. Later on, there's a scholar in the 1850s by the name of... So J and E are two distinct sources under Ostruck. Deuteronomy is another source, which is late from the time of Josiah. So those are sort of the first few pieces that are put in place to sort of modern source criticism. A guy named Hupfeld in 1853 points to 4 sources. So Hupfeld argues that there were actually 2 separate writers who used Elohim, and this becomes E1 and E2. And he proposes that Deuteronomy was a separate document all to itself, which is just D. And so now there's 4 basic documents, J, the Yahwist. Now, J becomes the Yahwist because in German, Yahweh is pronounced or spelled J-A-H-W-E-H. Yahweh is how you spell it in German. J, E1, E2, and D. And Hupfeld emphasizes the role of an editor, that we don't know who this guy is, but there was an editor who ties all of these things together. And this is the idea of redaction, like it's redacted by somebody at a later time. And this idea becomes popular among later scholars who use, this becomes a convenient way to explain how the things came together, and if there's any inconsistencies within the theory, well, then just you can sort of point to the redactor who's unknown. The time and place is unknown. So, but anyway, with Hupfeld, we have 4 major sources that were identified. But there's still more work to be done regarding the historical context of these sources. So the sources are sort of out there, but they have to be sort of fleshed out a little bit. Graf, who comes a little bit later, he identifies the 4th source as the priestly source. And the classic source critical perspective of JEDP is, people point to Wellhausen, but they'll often say Graf Wellhausen. So we're getting towards the end of the classic description here. Anyway, Graf believed that the date of much of the Pentateuch came from a late, namely a Persian, time period. He argued for a foundation document that was concerned mostly with priestly interests. This he dated later than Deuteronomy, which De Wet had established at 622. He associated this so-called priestly document to the time of Ezra. And so by attempting to assign dates to each of these documents, Graf went beyond source criticism and expanded the discussion to historical criticism. And this paved the way for Wellhausen's formulation of the documentary hypothesis, which is sometimes called the Graf-Wellhausen hypothesis. Okay, so then last but not least, we have Wellhausen. He's a German scholar German scholars were divided over the date and the sequence of the sources. Should it be PEJD or should it be JEDP? And Wellhausen published books in 1877 and 1883 where he settles the debate, and he gives the documentary hypothesis its sort of classic expression. He begins by accepting that the source analysis of previous scholars, especially Graf, like that guy's okay. And his main contribution was adopting evolutionary concepts from the 19th century and applying them to the history of Israel. And this can also be viewed almost like an Enlightenment idea. Like if going back to the original sources, that's what's key. And for Wellhausen, he would look at J as the earliest source, and he thought that the Yahwist really had like this fantastic theology and worldview, which was later corrupted, especially by the priestly writer. And it's and not to get into mid 19th century or 20th century German politics, but it's sort of this progressive. It sort of ties in with ideas of evolution, right? The text is evolving and growing. Okay, so he explains how the sources grew and how they were related to successive stages of Israelite history. His explanation of sources and how they were created, this becomes really popular for a brief period of time. Yeah, in one way you can sort of count down from 9th century to 8th century to 7th century to 6th century if you want to remember where he places these things. So J is in the 900s or around the 9th century. E is from the 8th century. D is from the 7th century, and P is from the 6th century. That sort of works. And this image here I scanned out of John Walton's introduction to the Old Testament, and I just found this very useful in terms of establishing lines of relationship and then also setting that within a chronological framework. So in the classic notion, the Yahwist wrote around the year 950, and the Elohist wrote around the year 750, and these were separate from each other. So the Yahwist was writing back in the days of Solomon's court, whereas the Elohist is writing shortly before the destruction of the northern kingdom. And then after the north is destroyed in 722, or on this chronology they give it 732. People debate these dates, by the way. The Yahwist and the Elohist are brought together by a redactor. Shortly after that, in the days of Josiah, you have the Deuteronomist writing his law code. And then, after the fall of the southern kingdom, the priestly writer, drawing upon traditions that predate the destruction, writes his thing. And then J, E, and P are brought together, and then finally J, E, and D and P are brought together in the Persian period. Okay, well, I'm very skeptical about source criticism. This is something I was taught. I went to Luther, and they were really into this over there. And there's a couple of guys out of Australia. Hold on, Australia. Let me grab the book real quick. Hold on. I'm coming. Okay, so it's Campbell and O'Brien out of Australia have a book. Now they do source criticism not only on the Pentateuch but on what they call the Deuteronomistic history. And if you just open up this book, what they will do is they'll say, okay, the text that is in bold, that's this source, and the text that's italicized, that's this source, and the text with a squiggly line by it is another source, and the text that's indented and italicized is another source. And so they'll come up with many, many sources, and you're constantly jumping from one source to the next, and it becomes, to me, it's very mysterious how they're able to find the seams within the text. And they know, in their mind, it's so clear that you're going from one to the other. When you look at the text, it's completely subjective, and there's no clear way of determining when you're going from one to the other. And so, and not only that, there are about as many theories of source criticism as there are source critics. That is to say, none of them agree. There's all sorts of schools of thought that are vastly different. And so it just, maybe there's sources and some of them are from a later time period, but I remain unconvinced. One thing that sort of helps me in all of this is the idea of Socrates in his humility. So Socrates was told by the Oracle of Delphi, which is sort of a prophetess in the Greek world. Um, in a place called Delphi, there was a temple that was built for Apollo, and they had a priestess there who would sort of see visions. Archaeologists today think that maybe it was located over sort of a methane fissure. She might have been somewhat in an altered state of consciousness when she'd say these things. But anyway, long story short, Socrates was told that he was the wisest man in all of the world, and he couldn't believe that. And so he goes to other potential candidates for this honor, and he says, "Do you think you're the wisest man?" To person A, and person A says, "Well, yeah, I probably am now that you mention it." And Socrates quickly becomes unimpressed with the vanity of the people he would ask, and it dawned on him like they're not wise, but they think they are. And so for Socrates, he ends up conceding that he is the wisest man because he's aware of his own ignorance. And I think that's just a great bit of wisdom from the ancient Greek world. And I think we should have this idea too, that we should have humility in when it comes to epistemology. We should have humility when it comes to what we know. And one thing that's helpful for me in understanding Scripture is C.S. Lewis. I think he's a great thinker, of course, from the Church of England in the mid-20th century. I think he died the day that Kennedy was assassinated. And he has this essay called God and Dock, and it's the idea that God is not a ship, right? You can take a ship and you can put it in dock, and then you can walk around the top, the bottom, the side. You can look at every inch of that ship and poke and prod and figure it all out. And theologians and biblical scholars will sometimes talk and write this way, that they've got the Pentateuch all figured out, and they've got God all figured out, or the non-existence of God all figured out. But we are finite creatures trying to understand the infinite. We are the finite creature trying to understand the infinite creator. And Lewis had a lot of humility when it came to Scripture. And of course, Lewis writes this way, having been an atheist who was very much against God. And I tried to hunt down the quote where I could find it. But as I recall, Lewis says he began reading Scripture in the hopes of discrediting it. And the more he read Scripture, the more he began to realize that it was Scripture that was reading him. And this has been my experience too, that there's something very deep and mystical about the biblical text. And you read it through once, and you have more questions when you're done reading it than you did when you started. And so for a book that's supposed to have all the answers, it's this fascinating book where it does have answers, but it takes time and repeated reading and great thoughtfulness and care to get at those. I just have a quote from Lewis here. He says, "Man approaches God most nearly when he is in one sense least like God. For what can be more unlike than fullness and need, sovereignty and humility, righteousness and penitence, limitless power and cry for help? The world is complex, and none of us on his or her own is sufficient for the demands of any given day. We need help. The Scriptures give wisdom for those knowing they need more than their own cleverness to negotiate their way through life's labyrinth." And so there may be sources within the Pentateuch, but I believe that the text is as God wants it to be, and it is something that is profound and deep and sometimes mystical, the way God works through Scripture. And so I'm not one of these people who has sort of outsmarted the Bible, and I'm content to revere it and study it with humility, because reading it has brought me to this, right? I mean, I've sat under very skeptical and crass professors who are happy to believe that the Bible is full of fairy tales, and I understand where they're coming from, because I've written papers for them, and I've read the books they want me to read, and I've heard their lectures, but that's not been my experience. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's sort of my conclusion to source criticism. Oh, hey. All right, moving on. Oh, there we go. Here we've got the very famous stela out of Egypt. Let me find the Maraneptah stela. And now we're going to jump into the question of the Exodus and history. And this is another topic that has been dealt with by many for a long time. And I thought I would just share with you some of the principal arguments for a 15th century Exodus, and the principal arguments for a 13th century Exodus, and the principal arguments for those who don't believe the Exodus occurred at all. Okay, well, here we go. The Exodus and history. A 15th century Exodus. Okay, well, there's the list. If you look at 1 Kings 16:1, it reads, "Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." And so in 1 Kings 16:6:1, we have this idea of 480 years after the Exodus, the temple was built. And so the building of the temple is not a debated date. And so there it becomes very simple. The biblical date for the Exodus then, as it were, is 480. And the argument against this would be that 480 is really a symbolic number. So 40 is, and I'm partial to a 15th century Exodus. I'm very credible when it comes to the Bible, or I'm credulous when it comes to the Bible, unless I have a reason to. The Bible's innocent until proven guilty, right? So the Bible is a historical source. So this would be one historical source dating the Exodus, historical source in the ancient time period. But the argument against it is that these are symbolic. So 40 is the number of years in a generation from a biblical world, from an Old Testament worldview, and you have 12 generations then, right? And so this, it's sort of like and 12 itself is symbolic. So you have like it's like the perfect number of generations has passed, like the perfect full number of generations, 480. Okay, so that's the rebuttal to 1 Kings 6:1. But 1 Kings 6:1 dates the Exodus to 1446 BC. Okay, and then the Maraneptah stela, which we just looked at. The Maraneptah stela dates to about the year 1220 BC. So, which is pretty fascinating to look at handwriting that's 3,000 years old, right? So it's an Egyptian monument that mentions Israel, and so in the argument that goes here, so Israel is mentioned as a nation in the year 1220, right? And if the Exodus never happened, well, why are they being mentioned like that? If the Exodus happened in the 13th century, in the 1200s, well, why are they known as a nation already by then? It would have taken time for the Israelites to be known as a nation. And so people who favor a 15th century Exodus point to the Maraneptah stela as a good argument for a 15th century Exodus. Okay, also the Amarna tablets. We had a cuneiform tablet at the front of this lecture. The Amarna tablets mention upheaval caused by a group of people called the Habiru, and this is a reference to the Hebrews that had become a nation by this point. So the Amarna tablets mention the Habiru, and the Maraneptah stela mentions the nation of Israel. One interesting thing about the Amarna tablets is they date back to the 14th century. So the Hebrews are mentioned in the 14th century, in the Amarna tablet, Israel is mentioned in the 13th century in the Merneptah stela. Okay, and then also the period of the Judges. The period of the Judges fits best with the 15th century Exodus, according to this first argument. The United Kingdom, the period of the United Kingdom is definite, right? People don't debate when David or Solomon would have reigned. And so that's sort of a date that doesn't move and doesn't shift. The farther back in time you go, sort of the more shiftable dates become. And so the period for the Judges then becomes one that can be adjusted. And if you take the biblical chronology as being accurate, you need about 400 years for the period of the Judges. And this is difficult to square with. So the period of the Judges, according to biblical chronology, is about 400 years. And if you're going to have the period of the Judges preceding Saul in the United Monarchy, you're going to have to push the Exodus back to about the 15th century. So the chronology with the Judges fits with 1 Kings 6:1 for a 15th century Exodus. So that's another piece of their argument. All right, arguments for a 13th century Exodus. The first argument is that Edom, Moab, and Ammon didn't really exist until the 15th century. Because Israel was in contact with these people, the Exodus must have occurred later. Right, so Moab, Edom, Ammon being mentioned early on in the Bible is sort of a sign that these things must have been written. The Israelites must have interacted with these people at a later time period. Another thing that a 13th century Exodus argument would point to would be destruction layers at certain cities, namely Lachish, a place called Debir, and Bethel. And this is the sort of argument that really comes from Wright, Albright, and Bright. So William Foxwell Albright is a very famous archaeologist who argues for a 13th century Exodus, and his student John Bright followed up that argument. And there's a lot of evangelicals today who sort of want to stay with that sort of classic argument, and they would say, if you look at Lachish, Debir, and Bethel, they have a layer of ash, a destruction layer that can be dated to the 13th century. And in the 15th century, there's no destruction, or these places weren't inhabited, something like that. That's how the argument goes. Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 says, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh." People who like this argument, the 13th century argument, they will say that this refers to the building projects of Ramses II, who lived during the 13th century BC. There were earlier Ramses. But this would refer to Ramses II. Also, Thutmose III, who's sometimes viewed as the pharaoh of the 15th century, they say Thutmose III was not a great builder, and Egypt's control over Israel during the 15th century, during the time of Thutmose, was quite extensive. And so here Thutmose III couldn't have been the pharaoh of the Exodus. So Thutmose III should be the 15th century Exodus, and people who like the 13th century Exodus say this is a terrible candidate for a pharaoh of the Exodus. And then lastly, Merneptah. People who like the 13th century Exodus, they would say that in Judges 15:9 and in Judges 18:15, Merneptah is probably mentioned. In Hebrew, there's the two words, Me Nephtoach appears. and they say it's common for the R to drop out in such pronunciations during this time period. And so if that's true, then this would support a 13th century Exodus. Okay, you have people in earlier German scholarship, namely a guy by the name of Alt, and then another scholar by the name of Gottwald, who would say that there really was not any Exodus at all. And Alt, he concludes that early Israel really evolved from sort of pastoral nomadism to agricultural settling or sedentarism. The modern archaeologist Israel Finkelstein, who's mentioned there on the slide, he's adapted and updated Alt's nomadic hypothesis, and Finkelstein is sort of a lightning rod. He often is in debates. His books are very popular, and so if you want to get a very modern and popular skeptical view of the Exodus, you could read Finkelstein. Gottwald has sort of a Marxist theory from an earlier time period that there was like a peasants' revolt against the powers that be, and that was a popular theory once upon a time, but it's no longer really embraced by anyone. Some of the things that these skeptical scholars point to would be difficulty with numbers, right? Sometimes the Bible describes miraculous things, astounding things, and they feel that they're too astounding, they're too extreme. And so the number of Israelites. So in Exodus 12, 37 and 38, it reads that the Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Sukkoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. A mixed crowd also went up with them, and livestock in great numbers, both flocks and herds. And folks estimate, is this 2.5 million? You know, if everyone has a wife and a kid or two, then you're dealing with this huge number. And then how do you enslave that many people? Although Harriet Tubman said, I freed 1,000 slaves and could have freed 1,000 more if they only knew that they weren't free. So that number problem troubles them, and why, if there's such a large number, why wouldn't they just revolt? Also the logistics of transporting 2 million people 150 miles or so, how is that going to work? And then also you have the issue of the midwives, right? 2 midwives are named for the Israelites. How is that feasible or possible? And you know, I believe that all things are possible with God, and so a miraculous thing doesn't trouble me necessarily. However, there are folks like Kitchen who likes a 13th century Exodus, or for those who like a 15th century Exodus, there's Bryant Wood, or if you want like an old standard, there's Gleason Archer, who go to great lengths taking on most of these arguments and coming up with responses to them. So anyway, not that you have to have an opinion on which one's best. I thought it would be good to just briefly touch upon these so you have a sense for some of the debates that go on. Because from time to time, people will come into a church, a Christian environment, and they might say, oh yeah, well, I had a professor, or I saw on YouTube or television that, you know, the Exodus didn't really happen, and blah blah blah. And it's good to be able to know where that person's coming from, and also provide an alternative that sort of affirms Scripture, and one that points to God being a God of salvation and truth and things like that. All right, well anyway, that sort of sums it up for our thumbnail sketch of the book of Exodus. I hope you guys have a great week, and I look forward to reading your responses to our first forum. Okay, great. Take care. Okay. No, don't go. Come back. I do this every time. I never quite know when the slide's ending. But my personal perspective, I believe the Exodus is historical for intellectual and theological reasons. Um, I believe we should have arguments that are falsifiable. That is to say, we shouldn't say Christianity can never be proven wrong, right? Or the biblical text can never be proven to be false. So I have intellectual reasons. Intellectually, I believe there is historical evidence that supports and corroborates the biblical account, right? I mean, my goodness, you have Habiru being mentioned in the Amarna tablets and Israel being mentioned in the Maranatha stele. These are sources that are thousands of years old. They're contemporary to the Exodus, within a pretty close period of time. So that's remarkable. Or I showed you the relief that depicts the Hyksos, the Asian immigrants coming into Egypt right around the time that Joseph would have been settling in Egypt. So I think you do find good corroborating, supporting evidence for the biblical account. One thing that's really not negotiable for me is that God is the God of history, right? There was once a book written like if Jericho was not razed, your faith is in vain. Razed as in with a Z, like destroyed, and making the parallel. Should we believe that everything must be historical? The resurrection of Jesus must be historical. Okay, most Christians concede that. Must every event in the Old Testament also be historical? I'll just say that I do believe that God is a God of history, and that if the salvation of the Exodus is not historical, then it becomes sort of meaningless, right? If it didn't occur, then what's the point? What's it describing? How is God a God of salvation if he hasn't actually saved, right? Does Pharaoh then represent some human plight, like being a bully or being cruel or something like that, and God saves us from that? Yeah, I mean, I guess you could go that way, but that's highly uncompelling. And then along with that, if the Bible is full of counterfactual claims, for me, that's tantamount to lying. It's if it is a book of historical fairy tales, then I have a hard time. I would have a hard time using it as a source of authority in my spiritual life. So anyway, that's sort of where I land. So big surprise. I'm kind of a conservative when it comes to reading the Bible, although I'm not a conservative in every way. Here I would be. So just being honest. All right. I hope you guys are doing all right and for real this time. We'll talk to you later.